Okay, finally of the presentations, I'm going to pass on to Aggie to hear from the World Bank Group. And in the users survey, we talked to both the World Bank and the IFC, so I think that the comments are going to be from both. Thanks, Aggie.
I guess it's live. Okay, hi everybody, good morning. As Nigel said, I'm Aggie Kiss. I'm the Environmental and Social Safeguards Policy Advisor for Europe and Central Asia in the bank, and also the lead biodiversity focal point for the bank-wide Safeguard Oversight Unit. So just so you know where to place me in that huge organization. I'm going to try to avoid as much as possible repeating what has already been said, but in some cases I probably will do that in order to re-emphasize some points. So as most of you probably know, the World Bank provides a lot of funding for investment lending around the world. Some of it is actually for protected areas and biodiversity conservation. Much of it is for other kinds of activities like large infrastructure, which have, of course, the potential to have negative impacts on protected areas and biodiversity. We also do a lot of policy lending, and we have ongoing dialogues with our borrower countries on a wide range of policy topics. And we're always looking for ways to increase the integration of environmental and social issues into those aspects of the World Bank operations as well. And by us, I mean, of course, environmental and social specialists, but also a lot of our other colleagues who are very concerned about these issues. I think it's important to know that while World Bank project task teams will always have an environment specialist as a member of the team, that will not always be a biodiversity specialist. We don't have the numbers to ensure that every project that could possibly impact biodiversity will have a biodiversity specialist on the team. And the environment specialists that are assigned to teams are extremely busy people. Most of my colleagues based in country offices are the environment specialists for upwards of 30 projects. So of course you can see time is of the essence. So with that introduction about the World Bank, I think you could probably gather that it would be very useful for the World Bank to be able to have access to a single database of widely agreed upon areas of biodiversity significance, which is reasonably comprehensive. That is that that there are not a lot of gaps. That is up to date, and that means not just in terms of official designations, but as was already mentioned, the actual conditions on the ground, because a lot of protected areas, of course, sadly have been greatly degraded already and really are not a biodiversity concern anymore, even though they are actually identified as protected areas. So we need to know that in order to be able to make decisions about investment. It should be map-based because the georeferencing is very important. And it should be, these areas should be identified at a manageable scale. Now I was very interested to hear that Chris is concerned that the areas might be too small, because our main concern is that the areas might be too big. So for example, it really does not help us for all of Madagascar to be identified as an area where no investment is possible. You know, this is clearly not a feasible thing. On the other hand, we do want to know where, first we want to recognize that Madagascar is not just any country. There are certain things that are special about it overall, but also we need to know where are the specific sort of management unit areas that are of particular concern. So some kind of a tiered or subclassification, as was mentioned before, would be extremely useful for us. How do we use, there are obviously some tools out there already, like IBAT, that we make use of. How do we use them? Obviously we use them for screening purposes, so that we have a heads up as to whether we're going to run into a situation where either we might not want to support any investment, or whether very careful environmental assessment and oversight is going to be required. So this screening function is extremely important. Also, we use these things for legitimacy purposes within our own organization and with our borrowers. It's much easier to go to our country director and say, sorry, that's a key biodiversity area there, rather than to get into a lot of the detail about what the issues are. But in order for it to work with this legitimacy sort of approach, it does have to be widely agreed upon. We can't have different conservation groups coming in and arguing as to whether that or the other is a more important site, because that tends to really decrease the credibility of the entire process for our senior decision makers. It's very helpful also, beyond the initial screening sort of function, to have associated information that helps us with our decision making as to what might or might not be an allowable type of intervention in a given area. So associated information like, why is this area identified as key biodiversity? Is it because it's a bird migratory path or a stopping point? Is it because it's the last of a particular type of habitat within a certain region? So what actually is the reason for that it's identified? Information about the existing management regime. Are these formally protected areas within the national law? Because our projects have to respect national law. Are they internationally recognized sites? Of course, if the country has ratified these in particular, that becomes part of our decision-making process. But also, if we wanted to engage with some kind of a management authority or entity to discuss what is and is not allowable and possible in a certain area, is there such an entity? And if so, what is it? Is it a national park authority? Is it a community group? Depending on the type of area, is there perhaps no actual management entity that we can talk with? Because it's been identified as an important area, but it's not a management unit of any kind. So all of these kinds of things are really very important information that we would love to have along with this geo-referenced database. I wanted to very briefly speak on the topic of no-go areas, which was brought up before. In our policy, and also I think I can speak for IFC here as well, it's not so much a question of no-go areas as no-impact areas, because both of our policies refer to critical habitats and say that we cannot support investments and activities which would significantly degrade or have any negative impact on the aspect of the ecology or biodiversity that makes this a critical natural habitat. It does not necessarily 100% exclude any type of activity, although, of course, for a critical habitat that's a very sensitive site, it might in practice exclude any type of activity, because any type of activity would in fact have such impacts. But the policy basically refers not to no-go areas, but to areas where we cannot support anything that would have any impact. So again, the associated information that could go along with this database would be very helpful to help us know when in fact no impact actually means no-go. That would be very helpful. Then I think though it's very, for an organization like the World Bank, a database like this, like the KBA, in a sense has to strike a bit of a sweet spot between a simple red flag kind of thing, this is an area of concern, be aware, on the one hand, versus a really detailed database with so much information that it basically substitutes for an environmental impact assessment. We're not necessarily looking for that because we don't expect databases like this to substitute for environmental impact assessment, for local knowledge, for local consultation. But we would like to have a little bit more information than just a red flag that says this is an area to be concerned about, take it from there. Let me just finish with a few concerns. So one concern for us would be if this became just another one of many competing databases that are not necessarily compatible with one another, because as I said, this really decreases the legitimacy of such databases if they disagree, if there's not a basic general community of practice acceptance of what the database reflects. it just confuses us, and particularly it confuses our management and makes it very difficult to deal with. So that would be one concern. Another concern could be general misunderstanding or misperception of what KBAs are, because I think that we all recognize they're not going to be just a list of areas where you can do absolutely nothing. So the problem for us is that if people perceive it that way, then we're going to be getting constant negative feedback and inspection panel cases and whatever that basically say you knew this was a key biodiversity area and yet you decided to approve an investment activity in that, and that you should not have done that because you should have known as a key biodiversity area and it's hands off. So this kind of misperception would make it very difficult. And I think it just has to be very clear and very well disseminated, exactly what KBA does or doesn't mean. I use the example of Ramsar sites, since I happen to be sitting next to Mr. Ramsar here, that not everybody knows that it's about sustainable management of wetlands, as opposed to necessarily 100% protection of wetlands. So we often get people saying, but isn't this a Ramsar site? You can't do anything there. So anyway, this is a concern. And then finally, I guess we might have a bit of a concern about the process, despite all of the consultation, which has been very excellent. Nevertheless, some concern that the process could ultimately be a bit too much driven by international stakeholders as opposed to national stakeholders in a given country. Because although we obviously pay a lot of attention to the international community and expertise and concerns, we also pay a lot of attention to our national stakeholders. Our borrowers have identified areas that are of importance to them for whatever reason. They may or may not be of the same significance on an international scale. I remember once being in Serbia and having someone tell me, oh, you must see this, this is absolutely important. It's only one of 5 populations of this particular plant in all of this northeast corner of this province of Serbia. Which to them was an extremely important thing, from an international level might not have been quite so important. So we think that there needs to be a balance, for our purposes anyway, between the national and the international perspectives of what is key biodiversity. And I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.